day of protests and strikes by Palestinians resulted in violence in cities and towns across the West Bank. Israeli troops fired tear gas into crowds as protesters burned tires and hurled stones. It was another day also of intense Israeli airstrikes into Gaza, and rockets from Palestinian militants fired back across the border at Israel. So Margaret Evans and our team are on the ground in Jerusalem tonight. So Margaret, as the days go on in this conflict, what's your sense of how it's evolving?
Well, Adrienne, as you know, there's huge international pressure on the Israelis to accept a ceasefire, but there's also growing pressure here in Jerusalem, in the occupied territories and inside Israel from Palestinians themselves, growing and more defiant anger.
This was the answer by Palestinians across the occupied territories to the Israeli bombing of Gaza and more. Long-held grievances that were pushing the temperature up here well before the Gaza campaign. Sheikh Jarrah, a neighborhood in occupied East Jerusalem, has been a driving force. Palestinian families living here threatened with eviction by Israel. And the unrest has spread to Israel itself and the mixed cities that are home to Muslims and Jews alike. At first glance, the city of Lod projects an image of tolerance. One plaza home to a mosque, a monastery, and a synagogue. But tense streets tell a different story. Lod has been under a state of emergency for a week now, after unprecedented scenes of mob violence between Jewish and Palestinian Arab Israelis. We met Suleiman Zabarka when he was arguing with the police, asking why they stood by as Jewish extremists set his property on fire. I live in the state of Israel, he says, but I don't receive full rights. I want the mayor of Lod to treat everyone in the same way. I hope he pays attention to the Arab sector in this town. The funeral today of a Jewish man named Yigal Yehoshua. He was hit in the head with a brick during last week's rioting after a young Arab Israeli man was shot. Yehoshua died of his injuries yesterday. In just a short period of time, people who once called each other neighbor are now afraid of each other. 5 synagogues were burned, and Jewish volunteers are setting up neighborhood watch groups for their community. Some look like enforcers, intimidating.
I don't see vigilantes. I see people defending their house.
Ayelet Wadler is a Jewish mother of 6. She insists Arab Israelis were behind the majority of attacks in Lod, betraying their Jewish neighbors.
They have been living together for 10 years. They have been helping each other change tires, carry groceries.
It's hard to imagine how these communities can live together given the anger unleashed. Arab Israelis ask how a city can accept them if a country can't.
Israel don't consider me Israeli. Israel is, the anthem says, land for the Jews.
Some people in Lod talk of a shattered trust. Others wonder if it was ever there.
So in some ways, that defiant pressure of Palestinians, it feels a bit unchanged from when we were posted there together many, many years ago. But I'm curious, what is fundamentally different in this moment of the conflict?
Yeah, you're right that the anger is still there, but I think it's the pileup, if you like, of the changes in the intervening years. You know, there's a security barrier there. That's what Israel calls it, the wall between the occupied territories and Israel. There is continued expansion of the settlements in the occupied territories, including East Jerusalem. And more recently, you had Donald Trump moving the embassy, the U.S. embassy, to Jerusalem. So all of these measures not going in the direction of the Palestinians, and the horizon is shrinking and the pressure is piling. And you've got a new generation, and you talk to them about the two-state solution, it means nothing. These are young people who say, if we can't have a two-state solution, we're willing to try a one-state solution and fight for our rights. They feel more independent than the old Palestinian leadership, and I think that's what's different, that the old pressures piling up and adding up, and a new, younger generation.
Interesting. As always, Margaret Evans in Jerusalem, thank you. Today, for the first time, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau joined other world leaders in calling for a ceasefire in the conflict.
We've all seen the tragic images, families, innocents, kids affected. It needs to stop. That's why Canada is calling for a ceasefire.
Trudeau says Canada will work with the international community to de-escalate the situation, and he says Canada's heart goes out to those affected on all sides. U.S. President Joe Biden has also expressed support for a ceasefire, but he has stopped short of demanding one.